Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest album from the Mountain Goats called In League with Dragons. I mean, sometimes it's just too goddamn good to be true. Now, granted, I think I would have been looking forward to this album regardless. When it comes to amazingly well-written singer-songwriter indie material, the Mountain Goats, they are long-running veterans, and they seem to be taking this time in their careers to venture into the strange nooks and crannies that frontman John Darnielle just finds interesting. Not just as a fan, but as someone looking to comment on or even subvert those subcultures and eras. He did it in 2015 with pro wrestling and Beat the Champ. He elevated his game to an entirely different dimension with Goths in 2017, which, for the record, is still my favorite album of that year. And in 2019, the new album was announced and was called In League with Dragons. And I mean, look, I've said before that I'm a nerd, and by that I mean I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for about 15 years across multiple editions, plus reading all the fantasy novels adjacent to and behind that series. I mean, I was a passing fan of wrestling at best. Goth culture was something for which I always felt a little on the outside looking in for as much as I've appreciated it, but D&D, that brand of fantasy, it's kind of formative for me, to the point where the stakes were raised even before I had heard the album. Now, I did trust they would do an excellent job. John Darnielle only growing as a writer, and this is a band with the pedigree to do this sort of subject matter justice, but I also knew that the reason Goths worked and was also a little bit controversial was because of its subversive and deconstructionist side taken to the Goth community. And given how close I've been to tabletop role-playing and that brand of fantasy, I wasn't sure I was ready for that. And I was also kind of wary for the possibility that said dragons could be a larger metaphor or symbol or idea. The track listings seem to be placing at least chunks of the album in the modern era, which could mean anything. But regardless of those concerns, man, I was excited for this album. So, no more delays. What did the Mountain Goats deliver on In League with Dragons? Well, I'll be blunt. Even with the understanding that the Mountain Goats were looking to subvert some of my expectations, I didn't expect them to take this path with In League with Dragons, which has about as much in common with tabletop RPGs and fantasy as I do with political office. As in, it's tenuous, you might be able to see the parallels, you could even see where it could be a good idea, but it'll likely never materialize in the way that it probably should. And indeed, if In League with Dragons is the third conceptual experiment in the wake of Beat the Champ and Goths, it is by far the loosest, and which doesn't so much feel subversive, but more of a pivot into some thematic territory that I myself have explored in some of my own original writing, which is certainly something I did not expect to be covering on this sort of album. And you know what? I just wish I liked it a little bit more than I do. And that's the other big surprise of this, because with few exceptions, this feels like the album that is furthest from its central ideas and feels the most diffuse and disconnected, especially when you consider a lot of the production behind it. And the bizarre thing is that I'm not even sure if longtime Mountain Goats fans would consider this a return to form, because while this isn't quite the tremendous stylistic pivot that came off of Goths, the tonal choices are distinctly different from what you would hear on previous albums. Yeah, for sure, more grounded in the guitars, both acoustic and electric this time around, with the shimmering swells of keyboards serving more as melodic embellishments that almost seem a little bit reminiscent of post-rock or a distinctly 80s or 90s inspired synth-pop swell, but between some of the more developed grooves and the tighter percussion, and across a fair few of these songs, there's this sense of tension that never quite delivers a release in a way that you would expect or hope for, and that's before you get the arranged strings, or songs like the title track where the pedal steel will come in just to emphasize that, yes, this was recorded in Nashville. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not against a more distinct and diverse sonic palette, especially if the hooks are still here, and for the most part they are. And not every album can have command of atmosphere both in concept and execution the way that Goths did and have that synergy. But then you start noticing how if you're gonna have an album, even with a passing relationship with fantasy storytelling, and none of the tracks really hit that epic swell the way they could, just feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. Yeah, the closing track Sicilian Crest gets kind of close, we'll get back to this one in particular, but it's no rain in Soho. And while we're in this territory, we should talk about the production, which in comparison with every single Mountain Goats album since 2005 is not produced by either Scott Salter or Brandon Eggleston, instead being given over to Owen Pallett. Now, this normally wouldn't be an issue. Owen Pallett's done arrangements for the Mountain Goats before, and it's generally accepted that John Darnielle, he would have a pretty heavy hand in whatever was being done. He's got a reputation for micromanagement. Until you see interviews where he's indicated he took less of a heavy hand in the tonal choice in the production. And sadly, you can kind of tell. The lack of epic swell, that might be one thing, that might be intentional, but the flattened pickup and the vocal clipping on the piano ballad Possum by Night and Going Invisible 2, that's not really excusable. And that's where you get to how the acoustic blending can feel really inconsistent with the strumming almost sounding too crisp right at the top of the mix. And I shouldn't have to say this, but there is a big difference in sounding lo-fi and just having some slapdash mixing. And sadly, there are chunks of this album that falls in the latter category. And especially when these mixes are not that layered or complex or ornate to work with, it's not really excusable. And it happens more than it should. But that's not saying that there aren't great tunes or hooks here. John Darnielle's right to call out how strong the grooves are on this project, and they really are. But when you have the Steven Wilson-esque Younger, the utterly infectious Waylon Jennings live, the phenomenal melodic passage driving Doc Gooden, and even the guaranteed sing-along that is Passaic 1975, there are a selection of pretty phenomenal songs. But then we gotta get to the lyrical content. And let's start out with the implicit question that John Darnielle frames, namely, the whole hero narrative, often at the core of so much of fantasy literature and iconography, and that he's going to frame with all the humanistic flaws and foibles that has made his writing so gripping and distinctive for years now. I mean, sure, there are songs that are described as being rooted in a more fantastical rock opera about an aging wizard facing down an invasion and his very likely comeuppance at the very end, but he's also not about to shy away from including the people who might seem to be wielding a certain amount of magic in the real world in their own right. Doc Gooden is a story telling the story of the very real pitcher who threw a no-hitter long past his prime. Passaic 1975 is written from the perspective of Ozzy Osbourne mid-tour in the 1970s, drinking and doing too much drugs as his body breaks down. And Waylon Jennings Live is from the point of view of an arms dealer watching Waylon play his ass off in a casino and just drinking in the fleeting dream as it is. And a few things become apparent about all these heroes very quickly. They're nearly all past their prime, their magic has taken a very real toll on them, and on some level, they're self-aware enough to realize the price they paid for their magic, but not self-aware enough to dull their bitterness and being lonely or forgotten, just hoping for one last moment to really seal their legacy in time. Now, you know what? This whole demystification, it's expected. It's happened both on Beat the Champ and Goths. And where I'd argue there's the most potential for some great humanistic storytelling. Heroes past their time trying to cling to relevance and past glories as they look to face down yet another dragon, and then drilling into why they would even want to. That's powerful stuff. And I know that because, well, I wrote a similar arc in my book To Kill a Dragon right here, which might focus a little bit more on the motives behind an act of heroism rather than the status of hero itself, but it is similar territory. And there are so many great details about that deconstruction. I love how Younger is such a haunted song and ends with a very Bowie-esque sax solo. I love how Possum by Night writes from the smallest of creatures and gives them a completely sincere battle cry. I love the pattern of rich baseball details on Doc Gooden, and an Antidote to Strychnine, it's a potent slow burn that shows the poisoner, characteristically the anti-hero, or at worst the villain, still striving to deliver something of a good, something that actually can heal instead of kill. But where things get a little bit frustrating for me is the suspicion that while Darnielle likes to use heroic iconography and framing in order to give some of these great men weight and give some power behind their stories, more often than most he's looking to deflate our expectations in them, level the playing field to almost the point where the hero's weight seem to be erased. I mean, the title track is the first obvious hint of this, and showing how kind of pitiable the lone hero's blaze of glory or quest for revenge can seem from the sidelines. But the most blatant cut is the closer, Sicilian Crest, which employing from garish 80s and 90s synth pop and the most propulsive groove on the album as a call for the hero. But the primary symbol is rooted in Italian fascism. And what's exasperating is that Darnielle's not even wrong about this, because a lot of medieval hero worship in traditional fantasy would be seen as having fascistic tendencies outside of it. And commenting on that cult of personality, he's not wrong. And it's important to highlight how he doesn't even spare himself, as Going Invisible 2 is all about new creations. They're always being built on the backs of what was created before. There's something destructive there, and there's something profoundly self-serving and burning burning it all down again and again to keep creating. But that leads to some sort of real tonal and thematic dissonance, when at its most earnest moments, this album really wants to pull under the raw emotionality that gets us there and then undercut it. It can almost read as very Last Jedi, if that makes any sense. And yet, here's what's missing for me: the alternative solution. And I'm not just talking beyond the previously sidelined anti-heroes of an Antidote to Strychnine or Waylon Jennings Live. No, what Rian Johnson actually understood with The Last Jedi is that there was a broader, more universal brand of heroism that had value. And what's exasperating is that I can look at tabletop role-playing games to point out the setting that drives that deconstructed point home all the more starkly and did exist for years, decades even. Dragonlance. Yeah, professional literary critics might scoff at books coming off the TSR mill to feed the fluff books of AD&D campaigns in the 80s and 90s. But when viewed critically today, Dragonlance was a deconstruction of traditional fantasy archetypes that allowed a more humanistic view of the hero's journey and wrung out so much more honest emotional power along the way. And no, it's not just because this was formative fantasy for me growing up, even more than Tolkien was. Most of the original books hold up and would have existed. I'd be surprised if Darnielle wouldn't be familiar with them. Yeah, the setting's been abandoned for years by Wizards of the Coast, but if we're looking for the thematic through line and follow through and that in League of Dragons doesn't quite deliver, it could have come from something like that. And for as much as Darnielle clearly gets the emotive power of this heroism, I wish he'd been able to complete the framing of the alternative to really drive this home, show what could work in its stead. There might be a place for those heroes. And coming back to the album, look, it's so well written and distinct that I'm always inclined to praise it highly, but between some real production missteps and the frustrating thematic issues that for audience who follow along might wind up dissatisfied, because even for albums like Beat the Champ and Goths at their most deconstructive, they fuse their commentary with their most glorious moments that had the purity to transcend. In League of Dragons doesn't really want to get to that point, which means for me it's an extremely light 8 out of 10 and a recommendation, mostly propped up by great writing and better individual hooks and grooves than I'll probably get credit for, but I wish it was better. I think it could have been better. Definitely worth a lot of listens. But hey, like The Last Jedi, it might fall short of some of your expectations or just wind up satisfying them all. I mean, give it a chance. Check it out. There's some dragons that, again, are worth chasing. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Again, a lot to say about this one, and yeah, this is a complicated one. It gets thematically diffuse. I wish it came together a little bit better, and I wish that the default calling card that Darnielle calls for heroes didn't feel as innately downgrading, because I think there is still a place for heroes in a different sort of way. But hey, if you want to buy or stream the album, links down there below. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious where you diehard Mountain Goats fans will fall on this album, because I've seen the critical reception not quite being as loving as it was of Goths, and even Goths was controversial. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And just a friendly reminder that if you're looking for a Billboard breakdown to be dropping today, the links is on the new channel. I've been saying this for the past month. All the new episodes are over there. So you want to see the new channel, links in the title card right over there. Go ahead, check it out, take a listen. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.